Hello, my name is Brody Myers, and I'm going to be talking about perception on performance-enhancing drugs in sport. The popularity of performance-enhancing drugs, otherwise known as PEDs, has really skyrocketed since the 1980s. We've seen it recently in football. We've seen it in the 90s for baseball when Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa were going for the home run record to increase the popularity of baseball again. We've seen it in cycling with Lance Armstrong, who had the scandal in 2004 for doping. And in the Olympics, we recently saw it with the Russian doping scandal, which caught the worldwide media by storm. A big reason for why PEDs have become so prevalent in our society are because of self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, self-fulfilling prophecies are twisting a situation to fit a preconceived notion. So the prophet uses what has happened to justify them being correct. So for example, if a coach starts to show an athlete less and less attention over the course of the season, and then sees the athlete's level of play decline, the coach could justify the reason for him ignoring the athlete based off the athlete's decline. Obviously, this is not the way that it works, but the prophet then justifies it in his or her head, as to why that preconceived notion is correct. Additionally, we could use this to show athletes' line of thinking with PEDs. An athlete could think that PEDs are the keys to winning, and they might be perceived as have already been taking PEDs, so they may as well use them. Again, this is not the correct way of thinking, but this is how the self-fulfilling prophecy works. A last example could be that an athlete could be hardworking but continues to lose, and sees an athlete that's taking PEDs and wins, and correlates winning to taking PEDs. Again, not necessarily true, but that's how the athlete could perceive it. The more reinforcement that a self-fulfilling prophecy gets, the stronger the prophecy is. So the more that we see winning, the more we relate winning to PEDs if that winner is taking PEDs. PEDs have been banned in all competition across all sports, but they are still widely used. The World Anti-Doping Agency, otherwise known as WADA, found only 1.2% of 243,193 urine samples tainted, which means that only 1.2% had performance-enhancing drugs or other red flag objects in their urine that would count as performance-enhancing. And additionally, some of those 1.2% were cleared of PED usage because they were used for medicinal uses. Sadas et al. In 2011 found that 14% of 7,000 athletes were doping. So on the flip side of that, they used blood testing instead of urine testing, which means that blood testing is better than urine testing at discovering whether or not an athlete has taken a performance-enhancing drug. And these percentages also only account for pro athletes. There are some studies and anecdotes that show that PED usage has been shown to start at as young as age 11. Most athletes don't get caught, but the public perception is very important. Dick Pound, who is the former president of WADA, states that somewhere between 10 and 90% of athletes have done doping in their lives. Obviously, this is an oversimplification of the percentages, but his claim states that athletes dope more often than we think. So obviously, the 10 to 90% is a very wide range, but it happens more often than we really realize it does. Perception may be based on demographics. So in the study, half of England soccer players believe that athletes do not use PEDs, while 1/3 of Australian soccer players believe at least 10% of all athletes use PEDs, and it could be a matter of exposure to certain sports. There hasn't really been enough studies done about PED perception, which is why the study that I researched had been done. The hypothesis is that age, gender, and athletic status determines status of perception. So for this study, 312 Australian students were chosen, and they were chosen to estimate how often doping occurred in pro sports, which sports were most prevalent, and determine the moral function. We'll get to those a little bit later. Those groups were divided up into 3 groups. There was one group for male and female. There was one group for ages 12 to 13, 14 to 15, and 16 to 17, and the last group was dividing them up into athletes or non-athletes. The result of the study: there was a significant relationship between moral functioning and estimates of doping. The children that took part in the study perceived that 28% of all athletes took part in doping, and the highest rate of prevalence are athletics, otherwise known as track and field, weightlifting, cycling, swimming, and rugby league. These prevalences may be based off of the country, since this was performed in Australia and not in America. Those sports could be skewed one way or the other. Like I said, there could be a bias. If it were America, it could be baseball, it could be football. It just depends on whatever country you are interviewing, will depend on which sports they say will be most prevalent. Also in the study, 88% of children believed that at least 10% of the athletes use PEDs. 20% of the children believed that at least half of the athletes use PEDs. So of those 312 kids, 20% of them believed that at least half of the professional athletes in the world use PEDs. The groups with the highest perception rates of the athletes that took PEDs would be the female group, the 12 to 13-year-old group, and the non-athletes. And interestingly enough, only 11% of the children athletes believed pro athletes of the same sport have used PEDs. So if a child soccer player in this group were to be tested, only 11% of those athletes believe that a pro soccer player would have used PEDs, which is interesting to note about their perception. So now we get to moral functioning. So at the very end of the survey, the students were asked two questions regarding when it's okay to use PEDs. It is scaled on a never, sometimes, and always scale, where never is 1 point, sometimes is 2 points, and always is 3 points. The numbers were added up and then divided, and the mean was determined for the groups. So the higher the number, the lower the moral function. So if a group were to have an average of 6, that would mean that they would think that it was always okay to use PEDs, thus having a low moral function. The highest scoring groups were males, 14 to 15-year-olds, and athletes. Notice how, typically speaking, those are the groups of those groups that would probably be in support for some sort of PED usage. However, no group scored higher than a 1.74. So no group really believed that PED usage was morally acceptable. Some of them just thought at some point or another it is okay to maybe use PEDs. In conclusion, something must be done about PED prevalence and perception. Between some children beginning doping at 11, blood tests revealing that 14% of pro athletes dope, and 28% of the public believing that pro athletes use PEDs, all of those are a threat to the legitimacy of sport in our society. And for me personally, I absolutely love sports, and I don't want them to go away because of PEDs. The simple solution would be to allow PEDs. It levels the playing field, but it causes a severe health issue. The smart solution is just increase education at a young age. We need to show our children how PEDs are unhealthy, and they are a temporary solution to a long-term problem. We need to increase the focus on hard work and practice. That way the athletes are actually getting better at their sport and not just cheating to get better at their sport.